"Please buy me and make me your wife," whispered the young Apache, wild and chained. Children ran barefoot across the dusty ground, chasing the laughter of the wind, while elders shared stories of courage, loss, and hope under the wide-open sky. From the very beginning, she learned to watch and listen. Her mother often said that a child's eyes could see more than words ever could. And so, she watched, learning the ways of her people, the rhythms of the seasons, the songs of the birds, and the whispers of the wind. Her family was ordinary, yet extraordinary in its love and resilience. Her father worked tirelessly, hunting and teaching, ensuring that no day passed without lessons about survival, respect, and pride. Her mother, quiet but fierce, guided her through the traditions of her people, teaching her how to recognize edible plants, track animals, and understand the language of the land. They spoke often of courage, not the kind that demanded fighting, but the kind that allowed one to stand tall even when the world seemed unfair. She absorbed these lessons like water soaking into thirsty soil, never realizing just how vital they would become. As she grew, she discovered that the world outside her village was not as kind. The sounds of strangers approached like storms, and with them came fear, confusion, and the first taste of sorrow. The elders spoke in hushed voices about lands being taken, about strangers who did not understand the ways of her people. She did not fully grasp the depth of it, only that life could change in an instant, and that safety was fragile. Even in her youth, she understood that the forest and the mountains were more than home. They were shields against the unknown, companions who could protect her when humans could not. Her childhood was not free from hardship, yet she carried a wildness inside her, a spark that refused to dim. It was in the way she climbed the highest trees and watched the sunset without fear, in the way she ran through the meadows as if the wind itself could not catch her. She was curious, restless, and determined, qualities that her parents cherished but also worried over. "You are like the river," her father said one evening as they sat by the fire, "strong and unstoppable, but you must learn when to bend, or you will be carried away." She did not understand fully, but she nodded, feeling the weight of his words without knowing how soon they would become her reality. One day, as the seasons began to change, darkness arrived, not the kind that comes with night, but the kind that comes on the faces of strangers who do not belong. Conflict spread like wildfire, leaving families torn apart, homes burned, and children frightened. The safety she had known since birth vanished. Her village, once filled with laughter and music, fell silent except for whispers of fear. She watched as people she loved disappeared or were forced to flee, leaving her with only fragments of stories, a few belongings and memories that felt too heavy for a child to carry. But still, she survived. She learned quickly that crying openly would make her vulnerable, that silence could be armor, and that observing without being seen could keep her alive. It was during one of these terrifying moments that she first encountered the strangers who would change the course of her life. They were unlike anyone she had met before, strong, unyielding, and carrying with them a sense of authority that made her heart pound in ways she had never known. They moved with precision, speaking a language that felt cold and sharp. She could not understand their words fully, but their actions spoke louder. They captured people, divided families, and left her little choice but to follow. Though fear clawed at her chest, something deep inside refused to bow completely. Her spirit, wild and unbroken, became her companion, reminding her that even when the body is restrained, the mind can remain free. Life after that was a series of harsh lessons. She learned quickly that the world beyond her village did not operate by the same rules she had grown up with. Trust was dangerous, and every smile could hide a threat, but she also discovered the power of observation. By watching closely, listening carefully, and understanding the habits of those around her, she found small ways to assert control over her life, even in tiny moments. She learned to carry herself with quiet strength, to respond to cruelty with calm endurance, and to protect the parts of herself that no one could see or touch, her thoughts, her memories, and her dreams. Despite the pain and the fear, she never lost her connection to her roots. She remembered the songs her mother taught her, the lessons her father imparted, and the stories of her ancestors who had survived far greater hardships. She would hum these songs quietly at night, allowing them to remind her that she was not powerless, that her people's strength flowed in her veins, and that one day she might find a way to reclaim her freedom. Even when the strangers tried to shape her into someone they wanted her to be, she held onto the parts of herself that mattered most. She refused to let them extinguish the fire inside her. Over time, her resilience became visible to those around her. Even in the harshest conditions, she stood out, not because of obedience or submission, but because of her presence, her sharp mind, and the quiet courage in her eyes. People began to notice her in ways that were both frightening and strangely protective. Her wildness, once a danger to herself, became a source of unexpected power. She learned that strength could come in subtle forms, through endurance, intelligence, and the ability to adapt. Each day she grew wiser, more careful, and more determined to survive not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Through it all, she continued to dream. Dreaming became a survival tactic, a way to remind herself that life could hold more than fear and captivity. She imagined herself walking freely through the forests again, feeling the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, and the earth firm beneath her feet. She imagined speaking to her family, laughing with them, and living a life that was her own. These visions kept her going, fueled her decisions, and gave her the courage to endure the cruelty she could not yet escape. In the quiet moments, when the world seemed most cruel, she would close her eyes and let her spirit wander to those safe places of memory and hope. Even in the darkest times, she found ways to connect with others, those who had also been displaced, lost, or silenced. She learned to read their expressions, to understand their unspoken words, and to find solidarity in shared suffering. These connections, though small and fleeting, reminded her that humanity could still exist in the midst of cruelty, that kindness could survive even where injustice ruled, and that she was not alone in her struggle. Each bond, each whispered word of encouragement, strengthened her resolve to survive and, one day, reclaim her life. By the time she reached her early teens, she had become a young woman defined not by the chains around her, but by the fire within. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even when others tried to strip her of it. Her eyes, sharp and alert, reflected both the pain of the past and the hope of the future. She had learned the harshest truths about the world, yet she had also discovered the depths of her own courage. She had survived hunger, fear, and displacement, and each day added another layer of resilience to her spirit. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she was no longer the helpless child who had been taken from her home. She was a survivor, a thinker, and a dreamer, ready for the next chapter of her life with eyes wide open. And so her story continued, not in the safety of her village, not in the innocence of her childhood, but in the harsh, complex world that had tested her from the start. She was no longer just a girl. She was a force, wild and untamed, carrying the lessons of her people and the memories of her home within her. Each day, each challenge, each moment of fear or hope became a thread in the fabric of her life, creating a story of resilience, survival, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Life in captivity was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was not just the loss of freedom that weighed on her, but the endless uncertainty of what each day would bring. The people around her spoke a language that was foreign and sharp, and their eyes often held a cold judgment that made her shrink inside. Yet, despite everything, she refused to let them see the fear fully. She had learned early that fear could be used against her, that showing weakness might make her days even harder. So she carried herself with a quiet alertness, observing every movement, every expression, every sound around her. The first weeks were the hardest. She was given a small corner to sleep in, away from warmth and familiarity. The strangers expected obedience, and they enforced rules that were strange and sometimes cruel. She quickly realized that survival was not about strength alone, but about patience, intelligence, and knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Even when her heart pounded with fear, she found ways to calm herself, taking deep breaths and repeating the lessons her mother had taught her. You are strong. You are brave. You are more than they see. These words became a quiet mantra that carried her through the darkest hours. Each day was filled with small tests. She had to carry out tasks she had never done before, follow commands that made no sense to her, and endure the stares of strangers who treated her like an object rather than a human being. Sometimes they tried to force her into roles that she rejected inside herself, and she quickly learned that subtlety was her ally. A quiet nod, a small action done just right, could keep her safe without surrendering her spirit. She became skilled at understanding the unspoken rules of this strange world, noticing the slightest shifts in tone, the smallest changes in posture, and the moments when an opportunity for control might appear. Yet captivity was not just about obedience, it was about loneliness. She missed her family, her village, and the familiar sounds of home. Nights were the hardest, when the world outside seemed silent and she was left with only her thoughts. She would lie on the hard floor, imagining the soft soil beneath her feet, the scent of wildflowers, and the songs of her people. Sometimes she whispered the old stories to herself, retelling them in her own voice, keeping alive the memories of a life that had been taken. These quiet rituals became her secret strength, a way to hold onto identity when everything else was stripped away. Despite the harshness of her new life, she began to notice patterns, to understand the people around her in ways they never expected. The captors, for all their authority, had their own weaknesses, fears, and routines. She watched closely, learning when anger would flare, when patience would fade, and when moments of kindness, rare though they were, could be found. She realized that by understanding them, she could protect herself and even influence small changes in her daily life. It was a delicate balance, a game of observation and subtle action, but it gave her a sense of control in a world designed to take control away from her. She also learned to rely on her instincts, the same instincts that had helped her navigate the forests and hills of her childhood. Her eyes were always alert, noting every detail of her surroundings, the creak of a door, the shadow that moved across the wall, the faintest change in tone of voice. These senses became her armor, allowing her to anticipate danger and prepare for it. She discovered that even in the harshest conditions, a mind that refuses to yield can become a place of freedom, a space where courage and hope survive despite the chains that bind the body. Interaction with others was equally challenging. Some captives were older, some younger, each with their own fears and coping mechanisms. She learned to communicate without words at times, through gestures, glances, and subtle expressions. These silent connections became lifelines, reminding her that she was not entirely alone. Trust had to be earned carefully, slowly, and cautiously, for one wrong step could bring punishment or disappointment. Yet, even small bonds of understanding provided comfort, and she treasured them deeply, recognizing that human connection could survive even in captivity. Gradually, she began to understand the power of her own voice, not loud or forceful, but steady, deliberate, and careful. Words could be tools as potent as silence, depending on how they were used. She started to speak in measured tones, asking for necessities, sharing thoughts carefully, and making herself understood without drawing unnecessary attention. This subtle use of language gave her a small but important form of agency, a way to influence her life without direct confrontation. It was a skill she refined daily, observing reactions and adjusting her approach, learning that even in a world that sought to diminish her, she could shape outcomes in ways both clever and safe. Her spirit remained wild, untamed, and unbroken. Even when others tried to force her into submission, she carried a sense of self that no one could take. She would sneak moments to run her fingers over the earth, to feel the wind on her face when doors were left open, and to close her eyes and remember her home. These moments, small and fleeting, reminded her that she was still a person of choice, thought, and feeling. They were anchors in a life that seemed adrift, grounding her in the knowledge that freedom was not entirely lost. It lived within her, in memory and imagination. One day, she noticed a man among the strangers who behaved differently from the rest. He did not carry the same harshness in his eyes, nor the same rigid authority in his actions. She watched him carefully, unsure whether he could be trusted, yet sensing an unusual complexity in his presence. This man seemed uneasy with the cruelty around him, hesitant in ways that suggested inner conflict. She realized that he might be an ally, or at least someone who could understand the power of her resilience. This awareness sparked both curiosity and caution. She knew that careful observation could turn into opportunity, but she also knew the dangers of misjudgment. Time in captivity also taught her patience in ways her childhood never had. Days blurred into weeks and weeks into months. Every small victory, every moment of autonomy or insight felt monumental. She celebrated quietly when she managed to protect herself, when she learned a new skill, or when she noticed something others overlooked. These victories, though invisible to most, strengthened her confidence and sharpened her intelligence. She learned that endurance was not just about surviving each day, but about gathering strength for the days ahead, preparing for opportunities that might come with patience, courage, and wisdom. Even as her body endured hardship, her mind remained agile and inventive. She began to imagine strategies, to consider ways she could influence her environment without attracting danger. She thought about escape, not recklessly but thoughtfully, mapping possibilities in her mind, understanding obstacles and considering allies carefully. Every decision became a lesson, every observation a tool. She had learned the most important truth of captivity, that the mind could remain free even when the body was bound, and that survival depended as much on intelligence as on endurance. Through all these experiences, she never stopped dreaming. She imagined herself walking freely, returning to her village, reconnecting with her family and living life on her own terms. These dreams were more than fantasies. They were lifelines, reminders that her spirit could not be caged. They fueled her determination, giving her strength when despair threatened to take hold. She held onto these visions, nurturing them like fragile seeds, knowing that one day they might grow into reality. In the quiet moments of reflection, she began to understand the depth of her own resilience. She realized that survival was not just about avoiding harm, but about maintaining identity, dignity, and hope. She had endured so much already, and each day added another layer of strength. Her chains might bind her body, but they could not restrain her mind or her heart. She had become a master of endurance, a careful observer and a silent strategist, ready for the moment when opportunity might arrive. And so, life in captivity continued, challenging her, shaping her, and testing her in every imaginable way. Yet through fear, loneliness, and uncertainty, she emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. She was no longer just a girl taken from her home. She was a survivor, learning the harsh lessons of the world, holding onto the wild spirit that refused to bow, and preparing for the moment when she could reclaim her life and her freedom. Each day was a story, each struggle a teacher, and each small triumph a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, a human spirit can endure, adapt, and remain unbroken. The days had grown long and heavy. each one blending into the next like shadows stretching across a quiet forest. She had learned to endure the captivity, to read the movements of those around her, and to hide the fire in her eyes from those who would use it against her. Yet, despite her careful observation and quiet strength, she had never felt truly seen. No one recognized the depth of her mind, the intelligence that measured every step and word, or the courage that refused to bend. Her life had been reduced to routines, chores, and the constant awareness that a single misstep could bring punishment. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of hope still glimmered, fragile but unextinguished. It was during one of these long, quiet afternoons that she noticed a change in the air, a presence that felt different from the others. He was a man among the strangers, not cruel like the rest, but uncertain, almost hesitant in his actions. His eyes did not carry the cold judgment she had grown accustomed to. Instead, they reflected an inner struggle, a conflict between what he was expected to do and what he knew in his heart was right. She observed him carefully, unsure if this awareness was dangerous or a potential lifeline. Something about him suggested that he might see her as more than an object, that he might recognize the wildness in her spirit rather than trying to extinguish it. Her thoughts raced as she considered the possibilities. Could he be trusted? Was it worth the risk to reach out, to speak in a way she had never dared before? Every instinct told her to be cautious, yet another part of her, the part that had survived so many impossible moments, urged her to act. She realized that silence had carried her only so far, and that sometimes survival demanded boldness, intelligence, and courage in the face of fear. This was one of those moments, a delicate balance between hope and danger, and she knew that how she chose to act could shape the rest of her life. When the moment came, it was quiet and fleeting. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest, and whispered words that trembled at first but gained strength as she spoke. "Please buy me and make me your wife." It was not a plea for ownership in the way the others might have imagined, but a careful request for protection, safety, and dignity. In that simple whisper, she packed years of fear, wisdom, and hope. She offered not herself as a possession, but her trust in the belief that he might act differently, that he might see her as a person worthy of care and respect. The man froze at her words, caught between shock and consideration. He had never encountered a situation quite like this. In a world where control and authority were often absolute, her request struck him with both surprise and unease. It was not the submission he expected, nor the defiance he had seen from others. It was something entirely new, a combination of courage, intelligence, and vulnerability that demanded acknowledgement. He realized immediately that this was not a simple transaction, not a matter of ownership, but a choice that involved ethics, responsibility, and conscience. Her whisper hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. She had offered him a challenge without words, a test of his character and his humanity. He considered the consequences of every possible action, knowing that a wrong choice could harm her, yet recognizing that a right choice could change her life forever. In her voice, he heard the years of struggle, the pain of loss, and the strength of a spirit that refused to bow. He saw, perhaps for the first time, that she was not merely a captive but a person with thoughts, desires, and the right to agency. This realization unsettled him, forcing him to confront the cruelty around them and the part he played in it. For her part, she remained poised despite the pounding of her heart. Her eyes held steady, conveying more than words could express. She did not beg in the way he might have expected. She requested, carefully and deliberately, leaving room for his choice. In this delicate balance, she exercised the very intelligence that had kept her alive, understanding that control and freedom could sometimes be negotiated in subtle ways. Her words, though whispered, carried the weight of survival, hope, and the fierce insistence that she would not be broken. Days passed after her whispered plea, filled with tension and quiet observation. She watched the man closely, noting his hesitation, his small gestures of care, and the moments when he appeared conflicted. She realized that her words had planted a seed of consideration, an awareness that perhaps not everyone saw her merely as property. Her hope grew slowly, cautiously, like a flower pushing through cracks in dry soil. She understood that trust could not be demanded, it had to be earned and nurtured. In these moments, she learned that patience was as important as courage, and that survival often required both. At the same time, she continued to endure the routines of captivity. Tasks that once felt impossible became manageable through careful attention and observation. She noticed subtle changes in her surroundings, small opportunities to protect herself, and ways to maintain her dignity even when every day reminded her of her limitations. Her mind remained sharp, always calculating, always watching for signs of change. She knew that her life depended not only on the decisions of others, but on her own ability to anticipate, adapt, and act when the right moment arrived. The bond, though fragile, slowly began to form. The man began to show small gestures of consideration, subtle acts that indicated he recognized her as more than a possession. He ensured she had basic needs met, protected her from some of the harsher elements of captivity, and occasionally engaged in quiet conversation. She noticed the careful thought in his actions, the effort it took to act differently in a world that had taught him control and authority over others. Through these interactions, she began to sense that her plea had not gone unheard, that her voice, quiet though it was, could influence the world around her. Even with these small signs of hope, fear remained. She was acutely aware that change could be fleeting, that the world she lived in was unpredictable and harsh. Every day required vigilance, every interaction careful negotiation. Yet within this tension, she discovered new strengths. Her intelligence, patience, and courage became even sharper tools, allowing her to navigate the precarious balance between hope and danger. She learned to read the man's expressions, his hesitations, and his gestures, gaining insight into his thoughts and motivations. This understanding became a lifeline, guiding her decisions and actions with precision. The whisper that had started it all remained a turning point in her mind. She realized that asking for protection was not weakness, but strategy. It was an act of courage to place trust carefully, to articulate her needs without surrendering her dignity. In her heart, she knew that survival was not simply enduring captivity. It was using every resource, every skill, every observation to shape her life, even in small ways. And in that realization, she found a sense of power that had been denied her for so long. Over time, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. The man began to respect her insights, acknowledge her intelligence, and recognize the resilience that had carried her through years of hardship. In subtle ways, he allowed her choices to guide actions, consulted her thoughts in small decisions, and respected boundaries that others had ignored. She, in turn, learned to trust him cautiously, testing his consistency and reliability while remaining vigilant. This mutual understanding, delicate and careful, became the foundation of a fragile alliance, one that offered hope, protection, and a glimpse of autonomy in a world designed to suppress it. Despite the carefulness required, she allowed herself to dream again, to imagine life beyond the confines of captivity. She pictured herself walking freely through forests, returning to her people, and reclaiming her voice. She thought of the life she could shape through careful decisions, patience, and courage. These dreams, though still distant, gave her strength. They reminded her that even in the harshest circumstances, the human spirit could endure, adapt, and prepare for transformation. And so, her whispered plea became more than words. It became a turning point, a delicate moment where courage met opportunity. It was a testament to the power of intelligence, patience, and hope in a world that had sought to silence her. In this fragile space, she began to see that her life could be guided by her own choices, that survival was not simply enduring pain, but shaping outcomes with insight and courage. She understood, finally, that even a whisper could carry the weight of transformation, and that hope, carefully nurtured, could begin to open doors that once seemed forever closed. Time moved slowly, yet in its own rhythm, it began to change the delicate balance between them. What had started as a whispered plea for protection had gradually grown into something neither had expected. The young Apache woman had come to see the man not just as someone who could shield her from harm, but as a person whose actions could influence her life in real and meaningful ways. Likewise, he had begun to see her not as a captive or a responsibility, but as a human being of intelligence, courage, and spirit. This shift did not happen suddenly. It unfolded in small, careful moments, in gestures that could have been easily overlooked, but that together created a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Each day offered opportunities to observe and understand one another more deeply. She noticed the subtle changes in his expressions, the hesitation when he saw cruelty, the care in his voice when he spoke to her, the thoughtfulness in his actions. He, in turn, observed her resilience, the way she carried herself even under the weight of uncertainty, and the sharpness of her mind, always calculating, always aware. They were learning each other slowly, cautiously, understanding that trust was fragile and could not be demanded. It had to be earned, nurtured, and protected. The young woman began to test the boundaries of this growing trust. She started small, asking for minor needs, offering suggestions in ways that were careful yet assertive. She observed his reactions, noting when he hesitated and when he acted with care. She realized that her words and choices could influence outcomes, that her voice had power when used wisely. These small steps gave her confidence and reminded her that even in a world designed to limit her, she could assert her agency in subtle but meaningful ways. At the same time, the man faced his own internal struggle. He had grown accustomed to the authority and control of the world around him, where decisions were made quickly and often without regard for the feelings or dignity of those affected. But here, with her, things were different. Her courage, intelligence, and quiet dignity challenged him to rethink everything he had accepted as normal. He began to recognize the cruelty of a system that treated people as property and started questioning his own role within it. This self-reflection was uncomfortable, but it was also transformative. He realized that true strength was not in domination, but in protection, understanding, and respect. One day, a moment arrived that tested the trust they had built. An unexpected situation arose, something that could have resulted in harm or punishment, and the young woman acted decisively. Using her knowledge, her observation skills, and her understanding of human behavior, she navigated the situation with precision, protecting herself and others from danger. The man watched, impressed by her intelligence, courage, and careful planning. In that moment, he understood more clearly that she was not simply someone to protect. She was an equal, capable of making decisions, solving problems, and influencing the world around her. From that point, their relationship shifted in subtle but powerful ways. He began to involve her in decisions, seeking her input in small matters and showing that he valued her insight. She, in turn, responded with thoughtfulness, carefully weighing each choice and offering suggestions that demonstrated her understanding of both the immediate situation and the larger context. This collaboration, delicate and cautious, allowed them to navigate captivity in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Trust, once fragile, began to strengthen, forming a foundation that could support greater autonomy, safety, and even hope for the future. Through this process, she began to see the potential for a life beyond the immediate hardships of captivity. The knowledge that someone recognized her as capable, intelligent, and worthy of care ignited a new sense of purpose. She realized that survival was no longer just about endurance. It was about reclaiming agency, asserting dignity, and shaping her life even within constraints. This understanding gave her confidence, strengthened her resolve, and reinforced the lessons she had learned over years of hardship. That patience, courage, and strategic thinking could open doors that once seemed closed. The man also continued to evolve. Each interaction with her challenged him to act differently than he had been taught, to consider ethics, empathy, and the consequences of his actions. He began to act not out of obligation or fear, but out of a deliberate choice to protect and respect her. He recognized that true strength lay not in imposing will, but in offering support, guidance, and a space where she could exercise her intelligence and courage. In these moments, he experienced a transformation that mirrored her own, understanding that power, when used responsibly, could build rather than destroy, protect rather than control. Their growing mutual respect was not without its challenges. There were moments of fear, uncertainty, and hesitation. Old patterns of dominance and submission threatened to resurface, and both had to consciously choose a different path. Each small test, whether it was a decision about daily routines, a subtle negotiation of space, or a moment of emotional vulnerability, became an opportunity to reinforce trust. They learned to communicate in ways that were careful but authentic, to respect boundaries, and to act in ways that preserved dignity while maintaining safety. These lessons were hard-won, forged through patience, observation, and shared experience. As time passed, the young woman began to see herself not just as a survivor of captivity, but as someone reclaiming her life, her choices, and her voice. The man became an ally in this process, providing protection without dominance, support without control, and respect without condescension. Together, they navigated the world around them with a shared understanding. That freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the ability to exercise agency, make choices, and live with dignity. In quiet moments, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the loss of her family, the terror of captivity, and the whispered plea that had changed everything. She realized that every hardship, every observation, and every careful decision had prepared her for this moment. Her resilience, intelligence, and courage had not only kept her alive, but had also created the conditions for trust, collaboration, and the possibility of a life shaped by her own choices. The man, too, reflected on the transformation within himself. He understood that his role had shifted from enforcer to protector, from authority figure to ally. He had learned the value of patience, empathy, and deliberate action, and had witnessed firsthand the strength of a human spirit that refused to be broken. Through his interactions with her, he discovered that true leadership and strength lay in respect, collaboration, and the recognition of another person's inherent worth. Together, they began to plan cautiously for the future. Not out of recklessness, but with careful thought, observation, and preparation. They understood that the world remained unpredictable, that dangers still existed, and that challenges would continue to arise. Yet in each other, they found a source of stability, insight, and hope. Their bond, built on mutual respect and understanding, allowed them to navigate the world in ways that had previously seemed impossible, creating a space where agency, dignity, and trust could thrive. Even in moments of solitude, she felt a renewed sense of self. The lessons of survival, patience, observation, strategic thinking, and courage remained with her, but now they were complemented by the understanding that she could exercise influence over her circumstances, shape her life, and reclaim her voice. She was no longer simply enduring. She was acting, choosing, and preparing for a future defined by her own decisions. The man, likewise, continued to grow. He recognized that his strength lay not in control, but in support. By protecting her while respecting her intelligence, he contributed to a partnership built on dignity, understanding, and shared responsibility. This transformation was profound. What had begun as a forced interaction, dictated by circumstance, had evolved into a relationship based on mutual respect, careful trust, and the recognition of human worth. In this evolving relationship, both found something that had been missing in their lives. She found recognition, protection, and the ability to exercise her intelligence and courage. He found purpose, ethical clarity, and the understanding that strength and power could be expressed through respect and care rather than dominance. Together, they created a delicate balance, a partnership forged in adversity and strengthened through patience, observation, and shared humanity. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without difficulty, but it was real. Through careful, deliberate choices, mutual respect and understanding, they began to redefine what it meant to have power, freedom, and agency in a world that had sought to deny both. What had started as captivity became an opportunity for growth, insight, and the reclamation of dignity. And so, the young woman and the man moved forward, step by step, cautiously, yet with hope. Their bond was a living testament to the power of patience, courage, and respect. It demonstrated that even in situations defined by hardship, fear, and uncertainty, trust could be built, dignity could be restored, and human spirit could triumph. Together, they navigated the delicate terrain between survival and freedom, creating a new path forged by choice, understanding, and the recognition of each other's worth. Time had passed, and with it came change, subtle at first, then undeniable. The young Apache woman who had once been terrified, silenced, and forced into submission had grown in ways even she could hardly believe. Every hardship she had endured, the loss of her home, the fear of strangers, the daily trials of captivity, had shaped her into someone resilient, wise, and unyielding in spirit. But now, something remarkable had begun to emerge. She was reclaiming the parts of herself that had been taken, and in doing so, discovering a sense of freedom she had thought impossible. The man who had once been only an observer, an authority figure, or perhaps even a potential threat, had transformed alongside her. He had learned to see her as a human being first, not as property or a responsibility. He had come to value her intelligence, respect her decisions, and recognize the courage and strength that had carried her through unimaginable challenges. Together, they had built a fragile but powerful bond based on trust, patience, and understanding, a bond that gave her both protection and agency, and allowed him to act with integrity and compassion. She began to exercise her autonomy more boldly, making choices for herself, guiding her own actions, and asserting her voice where before she had been silent. Simple things, choosing when to speak, when to rest, when to act, became powerful demonstrations of self-determination. Her confidence grew, not in arrogance, but in the quiet knowledge that she could shape her life and influence the world around her. Each decision she made reinforced the lessons of her past, that intelligence, patience, courage, and observation were as vital to survival as strength and endurance. Even as she regained control over her own life, she did not forget the lessons of resilience she had learned in captivity. She had endured hardship without losing her dignity, faced fear without surrendering her spirit, and navigated danger without abandoning hope. These experiences became the foundation of her inner strength, guiding her as she began to imagine a life beyond the confines of fear. She understood that freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was the ability to make choices, to act with intention, and to live with self-respect. Her past, though painful, had also given her wisdom. She could see the patterns in human behavior, understand motivations, and anticipate actions. She could navigate difficult situations with insight and calm, using the lessons of observation and patience she had learned in captivity. These skills became tools of empowerment, allowing her not only to survive but to thrive, to act with purpose, and to reclaim the life that had been denied to her. In these moments, she discovered the full scope of her own potential, the power of her mind and spirit to shape reality even in the face of adversity. The man continued to play a supportive role, but it was no longer one of control. He had learned that true protection did not come from domination, but from respect, empathy, and understanding. He offered guidance when needed, support when sought, and recognition of her decisions at every turn. In doing so, he demonstrated that strength could coexist with compassion, and that human connection could be transformative when built on equality and dignity rather than fear and authority. Their relationship, once defined by circumstance, had evolved into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and shared humanity. As she regained her voice, she also began to reconnect with her heritage and identity. She remembered the songs her mother had taught her, the stories her elders had shared, and the traditions of her people. These memories, once distant and fragile, now became a source of strength, grounding her in a sense of belonging and continuity. She understood that her survival was not only a personal triumph, but also a continuation of her culture and lineage, a testament to the resilience of her people and the enduring power of human dignity. Freedom, though, was not simply a matter of leaving captivity behind. It was a state of mind, a recognition of one's own agency, and the courage to shape a future according to one's values. She took steps carefully, rebuilding her life piece by piece, asserting herself in ways both visible and subtle. She made choices about her environment, her interactions, and her future, guided by the knowledge that she was no longer defined by fear or circumstance. Each step, no matter how small, was a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of the autonomy that had been denied to her. In her interactions with the man, she discovered the power of collaboration, communication, and trust. They faced challenges together, navigating obstacles with thoughtfulness, patience, and mutual respect. She learned that strength was not only individual but also relational, that human connections could enhance resilience, and that shared understanding could provide support even in the most difficult situations. Together, they demonstrated that adversity, when met with insight and compassion, could lead to growth, transformation, and the reclamation of dignity. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, she began to envision a future where her decisions would guide her path rather than circumstance or the will of others. She imagined walking freely in the forest she had once loved, reconnecting with her community, and living a life shaped by her own choices. These visions were no longer distant dreams. They became plans, actionable steps toward independence, safety, and self-determination. She realized that the same qualities that had kept her alive, patience, observation, courage, and intelligence, would now allow her to thrive in the world she reclaimed. Her courage inspired those around her, too. Others who had endured hardship saw in her the possibility of resilience, the power of intelligence, and the importance of dignity. Through her example, she demonstrated that even in the harshest circumstances, the human spirit could endure and flourish. Her journey became a quiet testimony to the strength of character, the value of observation and patience, and the transformative power of hope. Each day she lived freely, each decision she made was a reaffirmation of her worth, her identity, and her right to choose her own life. The man, witnessing her growth, found fulfillment in the partnership they had built. He understood that his role was not to dictate or dominate, but to support, respect, and recognize her agency. In doing so, he experienced his own transformation, learning that true strength lay in empathy, collaboration, and ethical action. Their bond, forged in adversity and refined through patience and trust, became a source of stability, hope, and empowerment for both. It demonstrated that human connection, built on equality and respect, could change lives and restore dignity even in the aftermath of trauma. She also came to understand the depth of her own resilience. Every hardship, every fear, Every moment of uncertainty had been a teacher, preparing her for this very moment. Her survival was not merely the absence of suffering, it was the presence of strength, intelligence, and courage. She realized that while the past could not be changed, it had shaped her into someone capable of navigating the world with insight, dignity, and agency. Her scars, both visible and invisible, became reminders of lessons learned and victories earned, proof of a spirit that could bend without breaking. In the end, she reclaimed her life fully. She moved forward with confidence, guided by her own decisions and shaped by her experiences. She was no longer defined by chains, captivity, or fear, but by the intelligence, courage, and resilience that had carried her through hardship. Her story became one of survival, hope, and empowerment, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure, adapt, and thrive even in the darkest circumstances. Her journey was a reminder that freedom was not simply a matter of leaving behind adversity, but of reclaiming voice, agency, and dignity. Each choice she made, each step she took, was a declaration that she was more than her past, more than her fears, and more than the circumstances that had once sought to define her. In reclaiming her life, she had demonstrated that strength, intelligence, patience, and courage could transform suffering into resilience, fear into hope, and captivity into the opportunity for empowerment. And so she walked forward into the future she had carved with her own mind, heart, and spirit. She carried the lessons of her past, the memories of her people, and the fire of her untamed spirit. The world was vast, uncertain, and sometimes harsh, but she was ready. She was no longer simply a survivor. She was a woman in full possession of her life, her voice, and her dignity. Every breath she took, every choice she made, was a celebration of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit.